An individual posted the following question. There we go. What would the Buddhist advice be for someone whose basic needs are not usually met? This person writes, I have BPD, which is borderline personality disorder, and I've spent most of the past 4 years in various triggering and unstable living situations, which is difficult. There are some who feel that BPD is born with it. Other people feel that it is a trauma response. I'm not sure if stability is something that will happen for someone like me for a lot of reasons. I'm not looking for positivity and hope, though. I'm also not looking for people to tell me to go to therapy or take medication. I've been to therapy before. I'm not particularly interested in psychiatric medicine at this time. Please respect this. So I'm going to stop right there, and I respect your preferences. But I must let you know that the mind does not exist independent of the body. And in fact, there are some who would insist there are no emotional disorders, only emotional symptoms of physiological disorders. Trauma changes our physiology. Trauma changes the way our central nervous system and our endocrine system function. What I'm about to suggest will not reverse that, but it can help to mitigate some of the symptoms. And what I suggest is impeccable lifestyle medicine. So if you find yourself on an austere budget, here are some things you still can do. You can get fresh air, you can get sunshine, you can get body weight exercises. These things have a wonderful effect, a wonderful, there's a wonderful word I want to use. When it comes to me, I'll share it with you. A regulating effect on our central nervous system. If you can sleep in harmony with a diurnal schedule, which means, in bed by 10, up with the sun, that will really, really help. I currently live with my tantric partner. Before that, when I was on my own, I would shop at the dollar store and I would buy beans and rice and seasonings and vegetables and fruit. And it was a humble diet for about $3 to $5 a day. It wasn't spectacular. You're not going to find me, but it got the job done. A whole food vegan diet can be eaten on the cheap, and it can help to regulate our central nervous system. So sleep, exercise, fresh air, sunshine, whole food vegan diet, these things can help. Once again, they will not cure it, but they can help to regulate the symptoms. You'll still have highs and lows, but less manic and less depressive. You'll still feel rage. You'll still feel anger, but a little bit less rage. You'll still feel fear, but a little bit less terror. You'll still feel sorrow, but a little bit less despair. You will still feel impulses, but you will feel a larger gap between perception and action, which is great. These things can really help. Let's continue. This individual wrote, I deal with extreme jealousy for people who have more stability in their lives. So let's explore that. We cannot, despite the ravings of those who are purveyors of the rational emotive approach or the what's it called? The current incarnation is known as the self-talk therapies don't work because the front of our brain has not evolved to argue with our underbrain. Trying to use the front of your brain to argue with your amygdala, the seat of anxiety and aggression, is an efficient way of exhausting the front of your brain to such a degree that you could begin presenting with some symptoms of depression, which is no bueno. I do not recommend. So comparing ourselves to those who have it worse will not help. The more we argue with our amygdala, with our fear, with our aggression, with our jealousy, the more it'll just argue back. That's not the way. I'll tell you how to do that in just a moment. I'll tell you how to calm your amygdala in just a moment. We'll get there, I promise you. I'm aware, well, I guess I'm also tell you right now. I'm going to tap button 9. I'm going to tap the OBS button, then I'm going to tap button 9, and I'm going to tap the word button. Wow, okay. So here's the deal. When we actively focus or actively analyze or try to self-talk ourselves and try to self-talk our amygdala not to be angry and not to be anxious and aggressive, it's a fool's errand. That's what our amygdala has evolved to do. However, fortunately, neither the amygdala nor the prefrontal cortex constitute the entirety of our central nervous system. Consider, if you will, our spinal cord, whose fancy name is our autonomic nervous system. When we take a break from actively competing against our autonomic nervous system and instead begin to passively cooperate with our autonomic nervous system, we will notice the anxiety and aggression of our amygdala calming down. And we will notice our anterior cingulate gyrus's empathy gently stimulated. We will also notice greater peace. So let's explore that in greater detail. There are many teachings and many teachings that contradict other teachings about the subject of mindfulness and meditation. Those teachings are dispelled when explored through the metaphoric lens of neuroscience. We've already explored the folly of exhausting the dorsolateral and medial prefrontal cortex in the name of active focus and active analysis. We will get to their sustainable versions, which are spontaneous focus and spontaneous analysis, in a few minutes. Stick a pin in that. We begin with mindfulness. The seventh fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. Every time we inhale, whether we know it or not, we have already evolved to automatically access the middle bit of our spinal cord, whose fancy name is the sympathetic nervous system. It has evolved to help us to notice in a very special way, to vulnerably, passively, viscerally, randomly, and fleetingly notice mind's antics of perception, sights, sounds, sensations, flavors, scents, and the like, including the full spectrum of human emotions, intentions, thoughts, memories, and imaginings. The full spectrum, whether that which we notice is external or internal, physical or mental, pleasurable or painful, interesting or boring, glorious or grotesque. Fortunately, I have a hook for you to hang your hat on. The key to the most efficient way to practice mindfulness is also the easiest. Every time we feel our chest swell with air, silently and mentally we can recite the verb watch. But the question remains, what are we to do with that which we notice? When we notice lack, when we notice scarcity, when we notice jealousy, when we notice self-loathing, what are we to do? We meditate. Meditation is the eighth fold of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. Every time we exhale, we are wired to automatically access the very basement and the penthouse of that same spinal cord. Which are known together as a team as our parasympathetic nervous system. It has evolved to help us to relax to such a degree that which we noticed during our previous inhalation could fleetingly feel less stressful, less permanent, less defining, and even as non-graspable as a vast empty void. Now, any good English teacher will remind you that a simile is only as effective as it is relatable. Therefore, we have to ask the question, what? What is a real-world example of a non-graspable vast empty void? How about the illusion of the infinite azure sky on a bright and beautiful cloudless morn, which although could look tantalizing to the eye, could feel non-graspable to the hand. And so we see that whether we're talking about emptiness or no self, or dealing with figures of speech, metaphors to describe the experience latent within each exhalation. And I've got good news for you. I've got a hook for you to hang your hat on. Because the most efficient way for us to practice meditation is for us to silently and mentally recite the verb rest. Every time we feel our chest subtly sink, as gently we exhale. This is how we deal with the jealousy. One of my spiritual heroes, a person who was raised in a country that was once known as Odiyana and today is known as Pakistan, fellow known as Prahe Vajra, but who in the Tibetans refer to as Gaurab Dorje. He would have explained this. He explained that suffering is bodhicitta. Suffering is the mindset of enlightenment. What does that mean? As we relax into our exhalation, whatever empathy or jealousy we might have felt during our previous inhalation could feel as if they were melting into the simplicity of just emotional energy. Energy that drives the cogs and wheels of our metaphoric meditation machine. That is the 3-pound supercomputer between our ears. Let's return to the question. I have a pretty low-tier life for a first-world country, but I imagine it would be great to a Gazan or North Korean. Not necessarily, because in America we have punished the poor. We have a economic system that exploits workers and drives people into poverty in a predatory fashion and then punishes them for being poor. In many states, they've made homelessness illegal. So once the system has chewed you up and spit you out, they can then arrest you and turn you into a slave, basically, forcing you to work a full-time job for $1 a day for the rest of your life, which is an abomination. So there are many ways that North Korea is superior to America. They treat their people much better than we treat our people. Gaza, that is a living hell. That is a living hell that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. And I have great shame that my metaphoric cousins in Israel are just so racist and genocidal and imperialistic. That does not help to know, but it does contribute to my interest in Buddhism. I can definitely get behind the idea of stopping reincarnation. The world is fucked. So this is an important question, I think, or let's continue. But anyway, I was definitely less BPD when my life was stabler, but then it got a lot worse and my mental state did as well. In general, I've done a lot of introspection. So we'll start right there. BPD can be thought of as a trauma response. The body's extreme response to extreme trauma, the body's attempt to survive, to protect itself. We have evolved dynamic self-protection mechanisms, and they work rather well. So the intensification of the symptoms of BPD is not an indictment on you. It's more of an indictment on your circumstances and the lack of social safety nets that should have come to your rescue, but did not. So let's get back over here to the idea of stopping reincarnation. So I'm going to subject you to another diagram. Anthropologists and archaeologists agree that there is substantial evidence that our Paleolithic ancestors, for about 300,000 years ago, enjoyed a culture that nurtured, that helped them to be flexible, loving, rational, laid back, egalitarian, lucid, cooperative, and kind. Sadly, about 10,000 years ago, the advent of proto-capitalism during the Neolithic Revolution flipped that on its head. And all of a sudden, culture around the world began training people, conditioning people to be rigid, fearful, superstitious, controlling, elitist, cryptic, competitive, and cruel. That is why Sturgeon's Law reminds us that 90% of everything sucks. We see that in every facet of humanity. We see that in the spiritual. We see that in the secular. We see that in the vocational. We see that in the recreational. We see that in the platonic, and we see that in the intimate. When we look at the history of any spiritual movement, including Buddhism, we see that what the founder taught and practiced was radically different than what is practiced shortly after their death. We see, for instance, in Buddhism, we see proto-Buddhism versus institutional Buddhism. Institutional Buddhism talked about not taking any more rebirths or not taking a bad rebirth. Proto-Buddhism was a completely different thing. And let's explore that for a moment right now. Albert Einstein taught that any educated idiot can make things more complicated, more difficult, and more violent. But it takes a lot of courage and a little bit of genius to move in the opposite direction. Institutional Buddhism makes enlightenment seem to be very, very difficult, project requiring multiple lifetimes. The Buddha taught the opposite. In the second to the last passage, the discourse on the four bases of mindfulness, the Buddha taught that one could master his path in as little as 7 days. There's no mention that they have to be a special person living in a special time or a special place or receive a special blessing. There's no mention of anything for that at all. It's very matter of fact. What the Buddha offered us is simply a way to cope with the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. As we've already mentioned, the 7th fold is mindfulness, where we watch the antics of mind. The 8th fold is meditation, where we relax into mind's non-graspable aspect. Very simple. Simply by playing with these two, once every 12 hours or so, the remaining 6 folds take care of themselves. The more we practice mindfulness and meditation, the more we can't help but notice change. We see change in the seasons, change in the cycles of the moon. We see the sun rise and set. We feel our chest swell and sink. Ever-changing, one and all, there is nothing permanent to grasp. The more we practice mindfulness and meditation, the more our anterior cingulate gyrus is gently stimulated, the more we cannot help but experience kinder intentions, the more we cannot help but practice kind communication, kind conduct, kind commerce, together giving us 50% of the Buddha's Eightfold Path. The more we practice mindfulness and meditation, the more we cannot help but experience the right effort, which is the effortless effort, wherein our choices and utterances and deeds flow not from calculated contrivance, nor from scattered spontaneity, but instead from love's deeply centered spontaneity. I should have said from wild scatteredness. I misspoke. So this love's deeply centered spontaneity helps us to use all the parts of our brain, even the front parts, the most sustainable way. This is the key to genius. When we read the conclusion of the Buddha's most concise meditation manual, the fruits of the practice are true knowledge and liberation, or just fancy ways of saying we get so good at noticing and relaxing that we have come to practice them spontaneously, habitually, easily, and effectively. Let's rename the Eightfold Path as the Buddha's 8 tools. The more we practice mindfulness and meditate, well, think of it this way. As children, the tasks of learning how to use the toilet instead of our diapers, learning how to wash our hands, brush our teeth, tie our shoes, ride a bike, read a book, these seemed insurmountable. They even drove us to tears at certain points. But eventually, we got so good at those things that we could practice them spontaneously, habitually, easily, and effectively. The path of mastery is hardwired into our central nervous system. It is our genetic birthright. And so it's remarkably easy to master the path of merely cooperating with the autonomic nervous system already in our body. Let's return back to the question. In general, I've done a lot of introspection. I can mostly stop wanting or expecting things, but it also contributes to me being extremely suicidal. This is a very important point. When we squelch or repress our mental functions, we do more harm than good. The fruits of the practice, so peace and love are antithetical to anxiety and aggression. The more we try to control what we emote, the more we will trigger our amygdala, the seat of anxiety and aggression. And yes, that aggression can turn inward and become suicidal ideations. Once again, as we relax into our exhalation, whatever desire or contentment we might have noticed during our previous inhalation can begin to feel as if they were melting into the simplicity of just impulsive energy. That's all, just energy. It's not a question about believing. It's not a question about reasoning. It's a question about simply cooperating with the various aspects of our central nervous system. When my life was still stabler, I was still suicidal, but my disability was less severe, so I was able to do more things, so I was less intensely suicidal. Yes. I have watched nature programs narrated by Richard Attenborough, because who doesn't love Richard Attenborough? And I've seen, caught in film, the tragedy of an infant wildebeest being chased by wolves. And when the wildebeest could no longer run, it laid down and curled up in a ball and tried to go to sleep. It has been said there are 6 responses that our survival mechanisms have when facing anything. It is as if they ask the question, should I fight that? Should I feed on that? Should I fight that? Should I flee from that? Should I faint before that? Should I fawn over it? That faint response is our body's natural response to its experience of overwhelming peril. I read an article about Buddhist charnel ground practices which contributed to my outlook, but now I'm constantly hitting a wall. So the charnel ground practices of yore would go like this. Our charnel ground is where the dead were brought and dismembered and left to be eaten by wild animals, carrion eaters, of the land and the air, such as vultures and rats and the like, which is wonderful. It's very ecologically sound. But it can be a really, really scary place. Anyone who's visited a morgue knows that freshly decomposed bodies swell and belch and fart, and do all kinds of things that can enhance the superstition and fear of anybody. And so the idea is you go there and you mentally rehearse your own death and then pretend that you are chopping up your body, purifying it, transforming it into nectar, multiplying it into a vast ocean of nectar, and then offering that nectar to all the various Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Dharmapalas, as well as all the beings of the 6 realms of samsara, all the denizens of hell, the hungry ghosts, the animals, the humans, the demigods and the gods, including the big, bad, scary things, demons and people to whom you owe a karmic debt. And the whole idea is that we are transforming our fear of death into an act of wisdom and the wisdom of impermanence and generosity. And as cool and dramatic as that sounds, I mean, Marty Scorsese had a great time depicting that in Kundan back in the 90s. But there is no method that is more efficient than simply vulnerably, passively, viscerally, randomly, and fleetingly watching and resting in harmony with our breathing. That is the zenith of all practices. That is why it is known as the ultimate slice through. That's why it's known as the Ati Yoga, the highest practice. I've done all the practices. I speak not from dogma, but from personal experience. There's always someone ready to teach you, often for a fee, some new special technique. But nothing trumps simply cooperating with our autonomic nervous system. Let's continue. Honestly, I feel like socializing often makes it worse because then I'm exposed to how much better other people's lives are, and I feel that a community that's invested in me would help. Right, it would. It would. We evolved to be social creatures. We have 2 mechanisms in our underbrain. We have a dopamine-oriented system that rewards for competition. We have an oxytocin-oriented system that rewards for cooperation. The dopamine system might lead us to short-term pleasure, but it is the oxytocin system that leads us to long-term fulfillment. We are wired to cooperate. Whether it's in packs or tribes, or villages or nations, or hopefully the entirety of humanity, we're wired to cooperate. If there were Vulcans out there waiting for us, they're not waiting necessarily for us to get warp technology. They're waiting for us to grow up and stop being petulant children and instead cooperate with each other. So I don't really have a support system, but I don't really expect to get that. So anything else? Yes, I would like to tell you a story that was told to me. So this is one of my teachers. I've had many teachers. One of my teachers learned the story from someone else. So I guess this is like threefold hearsay. But when one fellow was escaping Tibet, he took a wrong turn. And instead of winding up in India, in a community of other Tibetan exiles, he wound up in a land where he did not speak the language and they did not speak Tibetan. And he was convinced, he was exhausted and tired and despondent. And so he found a disused hunter's shed. And he thought he would just sit there and meditate and read until eventually he died. And when the owners of the shed, the hunters, came back, he told them, or he tried to communicate, but he couldn't speak their language and they couldn't speak his. But they recognized his robes, and so they kind of communicated through sign language, just, gestures of respect and something like that. When those hunters returned to the village, they spoke and let people know that there's a holy man who only speaks Tibetan in our hunting lodge. A widow woman heard that. She did speak Tibetan, and she'd been troubled recently by nightmares. She wandered up the path, and the Tibetan monk, got an intuitive hit. He got up from meditation, walked outside the hut, and he greeted her with the words, "Have you been having nightmares?" And that opened a dialogue that was very fruitful for her, but also fruitful for him. She went back to the village, and before he knew it, he had a stream of people who were supporting him, a stream of people who were learning from him. And he confided in one of my teachers, the late Lama Gyatso, that a pure Dharma practitioner cannot starve to death even if they wanted to. And what I've found is that, and so he went on to say, or my teacher went on to say, that the more we want, the less we get. The less we want, the more we get. The application of that is not to repress our desires, but to process them. When we notice desire, we watch and rest. When we notice jealousy, we watch and rest. When we notice fear, we watch and rest. When we notice hunger or thirst, we watch and rest. I'm very disabled. There's been times as a Western monk, I've had a very difficult life, but I've never, I haven't died. I've been doing this for multiple decades. I've come close, but I've never been killed. I've never starved to death. I've never died of exposure. And so it's been my experience that the more we cooperate with our autonomic nervous system, the more we are able to flow from centered spontaneity, the more we transcend the tendencies to be rigid and controlling and instead be flexible and laid back, the less we are like Mace Windu or the Big Lebowski, and the more we are like Qui-Gon Jinn or the Dude, the more life works out for us. I'm not going to lie to you and say that it's all puppies, kittens, and rainbows all the time, but it seems to work out. Having completed our opening lesson, let us take a moment to shift gears. It is Obi-Wan Kenobi early Wednesday morning. At least it is here in Southern California. Come, let us meditate like a Jedi after about 30 seconds of housekeeping. This is the Dzogchen Sende Lama Jigme Gyatso of the Buddha Joy Meditation School. For more than 30 years, I have harnessed my autistic special interests as well as my ADHD hyperfocus to spend about 8 hours a day, almost every day, studying, practicing, mastering, and reverse engineering the teachings and techniques of each school of meditation so that I can become your personal, nerdy, neurodivergent guide to nirvana. Welcome, my friends, to Meditate Like a Jedi, which is made possible due to the generosity of viewers. Which is made possible due to the generosity of viewers just like you. So if you're watching on YouTube, on the Tube app, in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see the essentialized instructions. The most efficient way to practice mindfulness is to silently and mentally recite the verb watch every time we feel our chest swell with breath. The most efficient way to practice meditation is to silently and mentally recite the verb rest every time we feel our chest subtly sink as gently we exhale. Together, let us meditate like a Jedi.